So the background to that is that I've actually worked a long time in endpoint protection and specifically working on looking at what the target asset is of an attacker, be it insider or outsider. And the other things I do, the reason he said one and only is because I run BSides London. I'm one of the directors of BSides London. I'm very active with ISSA. I do a lot of things all over the place. Don't follow my Twitter right now unless you'd like to hear sarcasm and rants and complaints about Brexit. That's why I'm wearing the yellow thing, because I need to leave the UK by next year. I'm not English. So let's get to the gist of the talk. I am going to change the format slightly. I still am going to do the 15 minutes of feedback into audience feedback, but I'm going to reverse it. I'm going to ask the audience questions to get your feedback on what you're doing with your incident response plan. So how many of you are actually doing incident response in this room? Do you do incident response? Quite a few. Thanks. So, as you know, we have a beautiful thing in Europe called the GDPR. I love the GDPR. But it's not only Europe, right? We're seeing a lot more legislation come out. We've got the Turkish data protection law, which is almost equivalent to the GDPR. There's one big difference. If you violate the Turkish data protection law, you go to jail. Okay? And you don't want to go to jail in a Turkish jail. You've got the New York Department of Financial Services that also has a cybersecurity regulation, and there's the California Privacy Act 2018. Does anybody know what the similarity between this one and that one is? Between NYDFS and GDPR? It's a number. 72. Do you know what 72 is? 72 hours, right? The amount of time that you have to report a data breach. You also have roadmap legislation coming into play. South Korea is preparing one. Japan and Canada are preparing some as well. Japan and Canada are doing it. I think New Zealand's on the list as well, because they want to do trade with Europe. And Europe is starting to insist that if you're doing trade with us, you need to have a data protection plan in play. So this is becoming really important for incident responders, because there is requirements on understanding where a data breach comes into play. And this is the gist of what I've been doing a lot with companies, is I've been talking about how do you actually focus your incident response? Because, so we're focusing on the GDPR for this talk, We're focusing on the GDPR for this talk because it's more or less what we need to talk about. So we have different flavors of incident response, but one commonality between each flavor of incident response is that you're focusing on the who, the how, and what they've done to your environment. You're not really focusing on the consequences initially, right? You focus on the consequences a lot more down the path. So the one on the left is, this is the typical, if you do your SANS GIAC CIH, that's the incident response loop from SANS. This is, I think, if I remember right, it's basically based on NIST one. And this is, we're seeing more and more of this. Does anybody know what the ODA loop is? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the ODA loop is actually a military incident response type thing. Essentially, you have 4 stages: observe, so like you're trying to understand and identify something that's going on. You evaluate what's going on to decide on how you're going to take care of it. That's when you get to decide, you choose the types of actions that you're going to take into play, and you act. So that's when you actually implement your response. So we're seeing a lot more of that. And if you go to the US, a lot more and more of the US incident responders are talking about this. The ODA loop. I kind of stick to the left because I like the left. It's simple. Because this one actually, although it's like very simply described as OODA, it's actually quite complex internally because there's a whole bunch of other loops inside each loop, inside each step. The preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned is simple enough to remember, and it's simple enough to do in a very process-driven method. So, are you ready to actually talk to the data breach and to report to your data authority? That's the problem that we have. If you think about what do we need to do, there's a really important part, which is the 72 hours to report. If you're only looking at, and that's the traditional way of only looking at the consequences of the breach towards the end, you're not going to hit that 72-hour target. And it's really important because it's when you become aware of the breach, right? So if you've detected an incident, that's when the clock starts. If you've detected an event that could potentially lead to an incident that could potentially lead to a data breach, that's when that clock started. I'm going to get back to this line later, but a breach isn't just exfiltration under most of these legislations. You need to notify the data subject. So that means you need to have an understanding of who's impacted in terms of whose personal data that you have is going to be impacted by this breach. But there's one important thing that a lot of people didn't realize is, you hear a lot, like the Facebook incident, the recent Facebook incident, right? The one with the API key that was leaked and some of the data protection authorities are looking into it. They won't get fined. I'm telling you this. Because it's not personal data, number one. Number two, what is an API? How is an API key going to hurt a data subject? This is the point, is that you need to report a data breach if it's likely to risk the rights and the freedoms of a data subject. And a lot of people miss this out, right? So they think, well, we have to report all data breaches. No, you don't. So it's very important to understand the consequences that might happen when you actually lose personal data. So before we can actually get down to detecting what personal data is in our breach, we need to understand what personal data is. And this is where a lot of companies fail, okay? Because GDPR defines it and interprets it. So it's defined in Article 4 if you like to read long documents. But the important part in GDPR is reading the recitals. And there's X number of recitals that actually define personal data. To sum it up, it's basically any information relating to identified or identifiable natural person. Right? So any information that will allow you to identify somebody. That can be anything from physical characteristics to electronic communications to anything. But it's directly or indirectly. So this is where the IP address comes in. I can use an IP address to indirectly identify a person. I can use a postcode to indirectly identify a person. And this is where you'll see a lot of people argue is how much personal data do you actually need before you can identify a person. So for example, I'll use the postcode again. The postcode in some countries is a city or a town. In some places, a postcode can actually identify an individual house. Like in the UK, there's certain parts of the UK where a UK postcode is actually probably one house. So if I have that one postcode, I can technically identify somebody, right? So this is where you need to be careful on how you evaluate that personal data. So if you look at most data loss prevention solutions or most technical solutions, they basically see personal data as this, right? So very simple: name, date of birth, gender, address, salary, comms, contacts, IP addresses, emails, addresses. But if you break it down to how you can identify somebody, it's a lot more complex, right? So this isn't valid. Not in my opinion anyway. This is personal data. Okay? It's a lot more complicated because you have things that go beyond just the individual. You have things like his work-related statuses. You have things like how he's using his mobile devices. When, where is he going? You've got medical information. You've got online information. You've got smart devices, IoT, CCTV, address, to top up the addresses. Then you have all the financial information. And then you have driving. Nowadays, we use more and more license plate identification, right? So if you go into some parking lots, they identify your license plate and they see how long you've been there. But if that data gets leaked out, that means I can re-identify some of your behavior, right? Then there's also other stuff. There's political opinion, genetic data. The interesting thing with the GDPR is it also defines certain data that you're not allowed really to store, or you must store under certain conditions. Things like political opinions, trade unions, ethnicity. They call that sensitive data. So there's certain aspects of personal data which are even more complex and which have even greater impact if you breach. So I did some work, was about probably a year and a half ago, where we started to try and break this down into actual fields that we could contain and describe and detect. And this isn't a complete list, but we started. I think we got up to about 125 plus fields, and we just stopped. Because we ran into some problems, right? So there's the very generic types of things. So like country tags, IP addresses, IMEI, GPS coordinates, social networks, email addresses, RFID tags. Those are pretty much common for any country in Europe, right? Then you get to the more country-specific things, right? So depending on the country, you may or you may not have an ID, right? So in the UK, there's no national ID. In France and Germany, there's a national ID. So you have different values for different countries. You also have localization, right? A name, right? Because we are not only just Roman alphabet anymore. We have Roman alphabet plus the Eastern Europe and the Eastern European alphabets. So from a technical point of view, you need to kind of address that, right? So you need to understand all these things. And it gets really complex. Then you get to the yellow box, which is the sensitive data, right? So that's kind of the things that under GDPR, you can store only if you have authorizations from the DPA. So DPA is a data protection authority, so that's things like the CNIL in France. I don't remember what the one in Belgium is called, or the one in the Luxembourg. If you look at the cash register on the bar, there's actually got a sticker from this register has been audited by the Luxembourg DPA. Basically, here, this information is considered sensitive because it actually describes very personal information of a data subject, right? So things like your ethnicity. So are you Muslim? Or your religion? Are you Muslim, Catholic, or things like that? If you think about the history of Europe, all of this, especially the top part, has been used in the past to target people and to do racial cleansing and things like that. So they want to avoid being able to actually identify types of people. So there's a whole bunch of political background into why they've actually done this, right? So let's get to the crux of the thing. What is a data breach, right? And how do we actually respond to a data breach with personal data? So if I go back to my loop, how do I prepare to identify all of this data? I kind of don't want to identify it afterwards, right? I don't want to identify it here or there because it'll be too late. If it takes me like 5 days to understand my breach, I'm going to be too late. So what I really want to do is I want to focus my attention on the preparation phase and the identification phase, right? So that I actually understand where my personal data is and I'm able to identify it as I go along. So this is a flowchart based on some work that the ENISA published. I think it was about 2017. Basically, this essentially boils down to the same steps, right? So we have the preparation phase, we have the event detection phase, and we have the containment and recovery, and then we have the lessons learned. But what they've done is they've actually looked at how do you go about understanding personal data in your breach, and when do you actually need to notify the DPA. So what they've done is, when you get an event, your typical first step is the event a breach? So you want to, at this stage, you want to be able to say, okay, I've got a breach. Does it involve personal data? You want to understand the circumstances of that breach. Was it exfiltration? Was it a ransomware? Things like that. You want to understand the severity. How many types of personal data fields are affected? How much personal data is affected? How many data subjects are affected? And you need to understand if there's an immediate response needed. So if you detect that it's a personal data breach, then you need to start thinking about notifications. If you don't, you just go down into your containment and recovery. So preliminary notification is, do you need to notify the DPA? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You need to. That's something that I usually hand off to discussions with legal teams, because it really depends on how you interpret the GDPR, and it can also depend on your local data protection authority. Does it adversely affect data subjects? So will it hurt a data subject? Will it hurt your customers? Right? So if you lose credit card numbers, yes, that might hurt that might financially hurt your good customers. So you probably need to notify your customers. That's when you do preliminary notification to data subjects. Now, you notice I put preliminary there because you need to notify, but the actual contents of the notification isn't necessarily defined at this time, because you need time to actually understand the total impact of the breach. So once you get to that stage, you go into further assessment, and if needed, you detail the evidence what data has been breached. And it's at that time that you do a detailed notification so that you can actually send out more details on what's been breached, the effects, and things like that. You go into your containment and recovery, and then you need to do a data breach inventory. That's an additional step that we don't have normally in the incident response process. You need to keep an inventory of what personal data has actually been breached. Because although something might not happen tomorrow after the breach, in 6 months, there might be a recurrence of that same breach. So you need to know what data was affected, but you also might need to report it you might need to go back and report what's the activities that you've done to actually protect the data following that breach. Now, this is the part that you need to do in 72 hours. Okay, so that preliminary notification is what needs to get done in 72 hours. And, my big question to everybody is, does your event detection lead you to this? When you escalate an event to an incident, can you get to that stage where you're reporting things at under 72 hours? So, breach. Show of hands. How many people think that a breach is just exfiltration? So if you have a breach in your organization, do you say it's a breach if you exfiltrate data? Good, nobody here. Because if you read the GDPR, I've been in a number of companies, especially on the other side of the Atlantic, where breach stops at exfiltration. If you read the GDPR properly, it's not just exfiltration. You have destruction. So if you get a ransomware attack, you fall under the GDPR. Right? So if you've got personal data, if you've got a database that gets encrypted by ransomware with personal data, it's technically unlawful destruction of the data, and you need to report it. Alteration. So this is somebody modified the data outside of the parameters of which you're collecting them, or somebody changes your information. So like I've submitted my information to a store, to a service. When a malicious admin goes in and changes my date of birth, right? That falls under the GDPR. It doesn't have any main consequences, but it falls out. There's one more before you take the picture. Unauthorized disclosure. So that's if somebody releases personal data to the press or to a dark website or things like that. And finally, unauthorized access. This is the killer one. Okay? If you have, let's say technically you have a data breach, or a breach, right? Somebody's in your systems. Somebody's got a persistent threat in your systems. They're standing there, they're listening, they're hooked into your applications, they're hooked into the databases. If they do select star from customer DB, that's a breach under GDPR. Okay, it's unauthorized access. How many seriously, in this room, do you think your companies are ready to do that last one? Probably not. Probably not. And this is where, I get okays from the top two steps. When I start to get to the bottom three, it's like people are like, do we really need to do that? Yes, you do. It's like, wake up. That's in the breach description of the GDPR. And it's funny because it's like nobody thinks about this. I recently did a pen test. Well, somebody did a pen test for me. And I was reading the results and I was like, I wonder if this company's actually thought about this part under the GDPR. So if you're doing pen tests, red teaming, you're okay because there's recital 47. You guys all know about recital 47, right? No? Recital 47 basically says that you're allowed to test your protections of personal data. So as security teams, you're allowed to implement tools and test the protections that you're implementing. So it gives CSerts and certs the ability to actually say, okay, we're doing this for testing purposes to ensure that the personal data is protected. So, the preparation phase. This is where I get lots of not questions, but do we really need to do that? And I'm like, how else are you going to actually determine if you've got a personal data breach? If you don't understand where your personal data lives and is, you're not going to be able to actually focus your incident response plan on that personal data. So I like to introduce this model, right? So, adapt, assign, identify, use, think. It's a very common model when you're doing threat modeling, right? Or when you're doing some kind of vulnerability models as well. So you want to adapt your existing models. So if you have threat models and you're looking at, your threat models look at the potential vulnerabilities in your infrastructure and the threats against your infrastructure, your systems, your applications. You want to look at those and say, where does my personal data fit into this model? You want to assign personal data related attributes as well. So is this critical personal data? Will it affect the user? Will it be disastrous if I lose this data? Is it sensitive data? Will it have more impact? You want to identify the risks, right? So, that's a typical threat modeling aspect. Use the DPIA. So do you guys know what the DPIA is? So inside the GDPR, there's a section where they talk about doing data protection impact assessments. Basically, it's evaluating the risks on your personal data. So you look at, you document that, and you can build your accountability based on this assessment. GDPR is a lot about accountability, to be honest. So then you got to think, will this harm the data subject? If I lose my credit card database, will it harm the data subject? Probably yes, financial loss, right? So you want to think about, if this personal data gets leaked, what's the impact on that user or those users? And once you understand this, you can put your controls in place, right? Because you're going to need controls in place to actually help your incident response. So this is a PIA. This one's actually from the CNIL. It's a really nice one. If you go to the CNIL, they even have a tool to help you do them. I'm going to skip this because this is more upstream from the incident response. This, when you're modeling your personal data threats, is really great. So this is an OWASP project. Forgot his name. It's the guy that runs Photobox in the UK. He started this. Basically, he's done data flow mapping. He's built a data flow mapping process. So essentially what you do is you look at your data source, right? So where's the data coming from? Are you the controller? So if you're a controller, what kinds of data subject information are you capturing, or who it is? What information you're capturing? Why you're processing it? Why the lawful basis of processing, where you're actually storing it and what security you put onto it, the categories of recipients where you might send the data to, how long you're retaining the data for, and some of the data transfers outside of the EU and the US. So basically, for an example, what you would do is you say, okay, I'm a controller, I'm looking at my individuals, I'm collecting tax details, pay details, pension details, bank details, contact details, because it's an HR database. Purpose of processing, personnel file, right? Or payroll. Then lawfulness is contract. I'm going to retain it for 1 year post relationship with, 1 year post contract. I'm going to put all of these security things in play. I'm not going to transfer it to any other country. Oh, wait, hold on a second. My payroll's outsourced. Oh, wait, I'm sending it to another country. Categories of recipients. So HMRC is a tax authority in the UK. Might have a payment provider, the banks. So you understand that the purpose of this in the incident response process for me is you understand, number one, what personal data you're actually gathering, how it's being used, so you can start to look at where is it going to actually sit, and where it's being sent. So where are my transfer points? So where potentially my areas where the data might be sitting in a weak zone, right? Or might be sitting in an area where somebody else might actually capture it. Because if you're the controller and say, the bank has an incident, it's still your responsibility to report it to the employee, right? So you need to understand that, and it has to be added to your incident response. So one of the ways that I talk to companies, so this is funny. How many of you have done data discovery, have done a data discovery process and actually know where your personal data sits? Not too many. Most companies can't fathom this. I've done a couple for companies, and they were like, after the first 1 million records, they say stop. It's like you can't, it's because personal data just becomes an explosion in a lot of companies. It just ends up everywhere. So there's different discovery methods. Fingerprinting is the easiest and the fastest, but you need to know what kind of personal data you have, right? So it's not always good because you have to have a pre-existing copy of all the personal data so you can fingerprint it and then go look for it. Pattern matching is a little bit better because you're actually building patterns. So like an address can be built into a pattern, so you can actually find them a little bit faster and you don't have to have a fingerprint. But ultimately, and especially if you start looking at controls and detection, regex is the answer, right? It's not good. It does a lot of false positives. But until we come up with something better in pattern matching, like NLP, regex is your friend. Or your enemy, depending. So basically, a lot of times what I tend to do to understand where the data is when I'm building my incident response identification process is I'll talk to the data owners. So I'll go to HR and say, where do you put the data? How do you use it? I call the environment. You can go priority tools. You can use Perl, Python. I prefer Perl because I'm old. And you build a data map. And then you can focus your detection. And this is the important part. You want to focus your detection. And then you want to do regex, right? How many minutes So here are some examples of regexes that I've used. So like Greek IBAN, Greek VAT, Greek national ID, UK passport, UK VAT, UK national insurance. National insurance is like a social credit code number. This nice little one is a bank account number. There's some Wikipedia entries here, the government guides you'll usually find. I'm actually trying to build a GDPR data pattern detection GitHub, but I keep running into customers, and I don't have time to complete it. I only have so many hours in the day, and so many hours in the day get eaten up quickly. But how the F do you regex this? This is personal data, okay? If you work for a bank, you have or anything that has a call center, and you're recording the calls for quality purposes or for auditing purposes, that's personal data. CCTV. Is your CCTV completely compartmentalized in your network? How long do you keep the tapes for? All of this stuff is personal data as well. I was with one company, it's like we have 15 years worth of printed versions of our documents. You have a GDPR process for that, right? It's like, no. I thought it was only IT. Like, no, GDPR, any personal data, right? So the extension of that is your incident response plan becomes really complicated. Because if you're not monitoring every potential outflow of personal data, how are you going to do the 72 hours? Identification, this is the hard part. Wait, no, data discovery was the hard part. No, this is the hard part as well. Do you have the right tools and the right alerts in place to actually identify when an event has personal data? So there's two ways to basically look at it. You do active detection, so you have some kind of endpoint or network detection system, or you do passive. You rely on data discovery and look at your events. I'll dig into that. So this is a process that I try to push to people and to get people to look at. So basically what I do is I run the data discovery, or I try to understand what the personal data is. I dump that into a CSV. I extract key personal data locations. I extract network paths, servers, locations, IPs. I build some lookup tables. The extracts that I do here, I can update into, if you have DLP solutions in play, we put them into play. We put rules in play that actually focus on on personal data. That gives you your network and endpoint detection in almost real time, let's say. Lookup tables, I push into your SIM or your log management platform to actually extract reports and alerts focused around the events that might have personal data. Then you can build alerts, personal data dashboards, personal data reports. You extract those reports for your personal data breach and your forensics and your notifications. So that's a quick overview of that. But, I mean, if you think about it, it's very simple, right? It's not too complicated. The complicated part is getting all that initial data, understanding where that personal data lives, and building it into that SIM platform. So these are some of the tools that I look at typically. So for data discovery, you've got you've got 3ed.org, but that hasn't been updated in a while, but that one's open source. You've got the typical players. Same thing for detection. I've been playing with using Sysmon and WMI for detection. It's complicated, doesn't really work too well, but I think it could work if we had a little bit more detection events in Sysmon. If you're looking at the cloud, you're probably going to start looking at CASB and some next-gen products like Darktrace, although I still don't believe that thing actually does anything correct. You feed that into your platform, you're going to put out reports, and you're going to send out alerts. And this is going to be the start of your detection, right? That's going to help you focalize your detection. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but that's one of the reasons why I do this talk, because I want your feedback, and we'll get to that in a sec. You feed your SIM with your endpoint detection tools, your network events. You capture your file events. That's very important. You need to capture the file events, because that's how you're going to detect if there's unauthorized alteration or if there's unauthorized access. And you want to do CVS lookups or external lookups in things like Splunk, Humio. I've been playing Humio a bit lately. So you can do things like this, look up personal data path CSVs on the source file path and destination file path. This is more complex. This is a Splunk, This one's a Splunk query where I'm basically looking for any personal files that are being copied onto cloud drives or something, or some kind of solution like that. The problem you run into really is if you don't have if you can't build this file, those personal data paths, you can't get these queries out. Right? It's very difficult to get those queries out. And so we're back to the problem of data discovery. This is another one. So here, this was an attempt that we tried to do, generate a low false positive, but basically we were looking at personal data paths and the user. Right? So we associated users with personal data paths so that we could actually detect if a user was allowed to use that file. So remember the unauthorized access? That's how we were trying to contain that one. So essentially, we built a set of files, a list of file names and things like that, or databases or network servers associated to a list of users. You can do this with products like SailPoint and things like that. If you have an access request and management system, you can pull out the users that are authorized to address certain servers or certain paths, files. If that file is open, if there's a file operation on one of those file paths, and you're not in the allowed users, then you can go back and say, okay, this is an unauthorized access. Notification, I think I'm going to skip. I'll go quickly for this one because usually I pass this off to a better understanding of your this has to work with your DPO and your PR and your legal teams. But essentially what you need to know when you're building those reports and when you're building the information that you need to capture is the types of the categories of individuals that are concerned, so number and people, data subjects, what personal data has been accessed or breached. I'm going to skip this one. It's a bit complex. It's not complex, but it's just not pertinent. So, I know, we want to have this interchange with people here. So I've actually come up with 6 subjects where I have questions for you guys, right? So I'm going to kind of feed this back to you guys. So if we talk about why and which, so I'm actually curious, how many of you, which IR process do you guys actually use? Those who know, do you use more focused on NIST or the SANS one? Show of hands for NIST. 1. SANS? Yeah, more on the SANS. I mean, NIST is very Americanized, so, I mean, and SANS has got more push in Europe, so I can understand that. So what about this? How many of you have actually re-looked at your incident response process since GDPR? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So like 10%. It's not too bad. I've had worse. I mean, it's a lot of people just haven't. The problem I found with that one is that people have actually gone off and said, "Oh, this is a compliance problem." And once they start talking about compliance, they start talking about all the checks and balances and things like that, and they actually think about the impact on IT security teams and things like that, and they don't follow through on the actual technical aspects of what we need to do. So, how many of you think you can respond in 72 hours? Does anybody have any opinion on this, or any opinion on this? On what I'd like to get your feedback on when you think personal data detection should happen. I've presented to you mine, which is during identification and detection. Does anybody have any other ideas? Nobody? You just haven't thought about it, right? It hasn't come across your path. It's hard.
Okay, so yeah, maybe something that we could try to implement in order to reach the 72 hours is to implement like flag in our inventory system to say not what the system contains, but just does it contain data that is belonging to the GDPR regulation or not, so that we know if the system is impacted at the beginning of the incident, we can directly send this notification. Even though we do not have the full extent of the detail of the data breach, we know that one of the systems has been impacted and the flag is true. So,
yeah, and it'll help you start that investigation, right? And I've seen quite a few companies actually take that idea and that approach. As long as you've got some kind of, as you said, a flag where you can start your approach, where you can start your thought process on, does this contain personal data that needs to be notified? It doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where it happens. It's just you've got to take into account how long is it going to take you to respond to that flag, right? So, because that flag becomes your kind of, when I became aware of the incident, right? So that, from that time frame, you need 72 hours. So what happens if somebody else tells me I've got personal data out on the internet from my company? Have you guys thought about that one? No? Well, I mean, it's just somebody else told me. I didn't detect it. Now that opens a whole another bag of that's not really related to incident response. What and where? So I showed you the personal data definition. How many of you have a very large personal data definition? Or are you? I mean, how do you categorize personal data in your organization? Anybody? I shouldn't have done this.
It's not a direct answer, but it's something my mentor told me in my company. He said that most of the time they say, okay, I need, for example, a motorized vehicle. So right. You ask, as an engineer, you ask, what do you want? A car, a boat, a motorcycle? They say, I want a motorized vehicle. And then something bad happen, they can come back to you and say, see, I wanted a boat. It's a boat I wanted. So I just want to keep the term as broad as possible so they can include what they want, what they want after this event.
I think you, to a certain extent, you're right, because if you look at the definition under the GDPR, for example, they say anything that can be used to identify an individual directly or indirectly. So the clothes I wear one day could technically be used, if they're very unique, could technically be used to re-identify me, right? But one of the great conversations I have with companies is, when does it become identifiable? A birth date by itself isn't identifiable, right? Because many people are born on the same day. So I mean, here's a story along that line. I was checking out of a hotel in Monaco last year after Les Assises. And I asked for my bill. And the guy goes, okay, so you're Thomas Fischer, you live in XYZ Germany. It's like, nope. And I'm starting to write down things. And it's like, is you sure it's not you, the date of birth? I'm like, We went through 4 names like that. And I just told the guy, stop. It's like, doesn't your manager teach you about personal data leaks? And the guy's like, no. It's like you just basically give them the information of 4 people. And it's technically a violation of so many laws. So the thing was, my name alone wasn't able to re-identify me directly, right? But indirectly, he could. He went through 5 different names that allowed him to identify who I really was. And that's the problem of this directly or indirectly in the GDPR. It's like a piece of information by itself may not identify a person. But if you get multiple data breaches and data and multiple pieces of data sitting in different applications and different databases suddenly get taken by the same person or get aggregated somewhere else, how far are they going to be able to actually re-identify that person? And this is the kind of questions that I haven't been able to solve either, right? Because at what time did they steal the names database, but then got the credit card database? And how does that credit card database relate back to the names database? I mean, I don't really have an answer to that unless everything's flat file, right? And you can extract it via the application. But as individual pieces of information, how long will it take that person to re-identify my credit card? Right? So you have to think in those kind of, it's a vicious game. Skip that one. So this one is also fun too, is how many of you who are doing instant response know the name of your DPO? Okay. That's good. Not enough hands, but that's good. How many of you interact with PR and comms people? Even less. Do you, as an instant responder, communicate with the DPA? No. It's the DPO that communicates with the DPA. That's the role of the DPO, as defined in the legislation. Who do you inform in the DPAs? Yeah, okay, so let me rephrase the question. Which DPA does the DPO inform? Because the DPO might come back to you and say, okay, so like, where did this data breach occur? If you're a multinational organization and it's a server in France with French personal data information, your first port of call is the CNIL, right? But if that database also contains German information, do I also go and talk to the German DPA? So this is where, depending on your legal team, you'll get an answer of yes. But if you actually read the legislation, they're supposed to coordinate, DPAs are supposed to coordinate across Europe. So technically, if I report to the CNIL, I can just notify the German DPA that I've reported to the CNIL that there's probably German information inside that breach, right? And it's not my problem anymore. So final thoughts, 28% of organizations not ready for the GDPR. That was last year. Just recently I read a report, 1 in 6 businesses are unprepared for a data breach. And this was my favorite. It was just recently, right? That's the British Airways one if you can't see it. 380,000 payment cards were captured over a 2-month period. I'm still waiting for the fine on that one. And the worst part is I literally booked a ticket a day and a half before this was announced. So I was really happy. I spent the whole morning with my credit card company details. So we're out of time. Thank you. I'll be around all day anyway, so if you want to come talk GDPR and insert response, I'll be happy to have a chat. If you want more information about the GDPR, I'm happy to chat about that as well. I hope you liked the talk. I hope I put some question marks in your heads. And thanks for having me. And thanks to the organizers.